morning, lovelies. Welcome to the final installment of How to Write an Evil Empire. If you're new, this is a 4-part video series where I talk about how to write an evil empire. We've talked about their literary uses, how they rise, how they maintain themselves, and now it's time to talk about how they fall. Or rather, how your heroes can defeat them. Before we get into all of that, a quick note, the Ultimate World Building Checklist is available on my website, but you can also get it for free on my Patreon. Both of those are linked in the description if you need a little more world building help. I've also started doing some one-on-one coaching, so if you need more personalized help, check out my website. It's also in the description. So, you have written an evil empire. It is terrifying its civilians, killing fan-favorite characters, and otherwise making a mess. Now it is time for the heroes to actually bring it down. But here's the thing. Empires don't typically fall overnight. It's very rare when they do. And you cannot destroy an empire when it's at the height of its power. If an empire has been around for generations, even centuries, then it is going to take a long time before it gets to a point wherein a band of plucky teenagers can topple it. But if an empire has only been around for a few years, like since Alexander or Genghis started grabbing land, well then it's in a much more precarious position, largely because there are a ton of people still alive who remember what life was like before the empire. We'll talk about that later. Right now, let's assume that your empire is much more formidable and has been around for a while. It's had generations to figure out things like succession, resource management, the military, all of that jazz. In that case, it's going to take at least a generation to dismantle all of that, probably more. The sacking of Rome happened at the very end of a centuries-long decline. It never would have happened during the Imperial Age or the Republic. It was just too powerful. This is why, especially in a lot of dystopians, it is explicitly stated that the evil empire or dystopian regime is in a state of decline. Things are falling apart. All the heroes have to do now is deliver the killing blow. But what gets the empire into such a pitiable state? Well, it's a lot of things. Teamwork makes the dream work, and it also makes an empire fall. Economic instability from constantly fighting wars to conquer more land, quite possibly some mishandling of funds for the sake of decadence. Social unrest from aforementioned economic instability and any oppressive systems that your evil empire is pushing on its civilians. Constant civil wars and putting down uprisings from said social unrest, or just a bunch of various parties grabbing for power. More economic instability from maintaining the military, who has to put down those civil wars and uprisings. Constant external wars to win and maintain their borders and resources, which eventually leads to foreign powers gradually chipping away at their borders as they lose more and more of those wars. Plagues, famines, and other natural disasters. Having one of these problems would not really be too much of an issue, especially for an empire, and if that empire has good support structures in place to minimize collateral damage. But usually these problems are all interconnected, and solving one typically means solving all of them, which is a very tall order even for an empire. But even with all of these problems, an empire is still an empire, alright? They still have things like armies, spies, and probably magic that makes it impossible for a ragtag group of heroes to overcome. You need an army to fight an army, so where are your heroes going to get one? Sometimes the heroes will ally with a friendly empire or a handful of friendly kingdoms to get the numbers. That way, the meat fodder can do the legwork for them while the heroes do the super climactic one-on-one fight with the evil emperor. Sometimes the rebel groups incite civil war by appealing to the vassals of the emperor, or the notables as we called them in the last video. These are the rulers of conquered lands who want, if not independence, then at least no outright oppression. These are the link between the empire and the conquered lands and citizenry, so if you snap that link, it's going to cause issues for the empire. You also have the ground-up option, where the people themselves fight against the empire. In real life, this doesn't work too great, as a trained military is going to cut through them like butter. But such rebellions and riots can still cause a lot of problems for the empire, especially if they're going after supply chains and other such resources that the empire actually needs to operate. All of this is likely to be instigated or encouraged by your group of heroes and or a proper rebellion force. If you have an evil empire, you almost certainly have a rebellion who wants to put a stop to it, or at least a stop to their oppression. Possibly even several, but not every rebel gets along with others. One of the biggest problems with overcoming an empire is that a lot of people have a lot of different views on how and why that should happen, as well as, most critically, who should be in charge and how after that empire falls. And these factions almost never get along with each other. Some groups may only be representing their home country and just want to secure their nation's independence. Who cares what happens to the rest of the empire? Other groups may want to replace the empire entirely with a different government system, like a democracy or other form of group leadership. Others still may have a problem with this specific emperor, wanting to get rid of them so they can install the heir or some other person who represents their interests a little bit better. These differing sets of priorities and ideologies make it easy for the empire to keep the groups from working together and pose an actual threat, pitting them against each other so they're too busy fighting one another to focus on taking down the emperor. But sometimes different rebel groups can put aside their differences and work together long enough to bring down the empire. Once that's done, however, they're immediately going to start fighting each other to determine what happens next. And what happens next is never pretty. When an empire does fall, that's the start of everyone's problems. The cleanest collapses are usually total foreign invasions that basically pitch out the old boss and put in a new one, absorbing the old empire into a newer, more powerful one. But without that, when it is a total collapse, the fall of an empire leads to more wars of all the various factions that work to take it down, or even built it up in the first place, as they all scramble to fill the power vacuum left behind. After the sudden death of Alexander the Great, his massive empire imploded within a week, largely because it was brand new. He had conquered it all himself and then he died. All of the lands that he had conquered decided that now was a great time to revolt and regain their freedom, and they were right. Alexander's generals went to squash the rebellions, but because each of them were also ambitious and power hungry, they decided that they were not going to bow down to the infant that Alexander had left as his heir. So they all took a chunk of the empire for themselves. Lysimachus took Thrace and a chunk of Asia Minor, Cassander called Macedonia and Greece, Seleucus took the rest of Asia Minor, and Ptolemy grabbed Egypt, kicking off a dynasty that ended in Cleopatra. Yes, that one. And because these generals did not always get along, they often fought, kicking off a whole series of succession wars that was supposed to decide who succeeded Alexander's place in the empire, ultimately leading to the answer of no one. Alexander's empire is a really great example of short-lived empires. We tend to think of empires as these long-lasting, ancient things, going on for centuries if not millennia. And some of them do manage to pull that off, but not all of them. The most dangerous time for a new empire is right after the death of the first emperor, because of the inevitable succession crisis. Even if the emperor has a clear heir, they might not be capable of ruling. Often because they're too young, too sick, or just too incompetent. Sometimes they're simply unable to fill the giant shoes left behind by their formidable parent. Everyone was willing to follow them into battle because they had the charisma and intelligence to pull it off, but their child is unlikely to have those skills unless they've explicitly proven themselves, usually in battle. Other potential heirs are likely to feel ripped off, and they don't hesitate to go to war over it. Because controlling an empire? That's worth sacrificing a few armies for, don't you think? Succession wars are one of the biggest downfalls of an empire because there can only be one emperor and everyone wants that seat. These types of wars are most common after the death of the first emperor, especially if that first emperor was dumb enough to try to split their empire among their most powerful heirs. That never works, Genghis. And because no one can be sure who's in charge, that leads to a lot of chaos and suffering, both during an empire's fall and in its aftermath. Resources that need to go from one area to another don't get transported, or they get stolen or redirected. People who relied on imperial laws to protect them and their rights suddenly find themselves vulnerable. People who find themselves homeless or starving due to these wars or a natural disaster or anything else, they don't have the support that an empire would provide them. The aftermath of an empire's fall is one of the most deadly times to be alive. This is why a lot of stories tend to have a rightful heir built into the ragtag team of heroes. They don't have to take down the empire or deal with the succession crisis. They have the successor on their side. They've just got to beat up the person who is keeping their seat warm and make sure that he doesn't get assassinated by any of the other power-hungry sharks in his court. This also allows you to have an evil empire at the height of its power as the main villain, rather than one in a state of decline. Technically, this wouldn't even be an evil empire, as I talked about in the first last video. It's just the upper tiers of bureaucracy that need to go. Kick them out, put the rightful heir in place, and they've not only toppled an empire at the height of its power, but they are now also rewarded with that same empire, now under their control. But of course, if your empire is already starting to fall apart for all of the reasons that we mentioned earlier, well then your rightful heir is in for a tough time. Which is great for you as a writer because you get to write a sequel about how this person struggles to keep the frayed edges of their power together, or the hazardous journey of turning an empire into a democracy, or the tragedy of this great hero going down with their ship. Even worse, if you follow the story for a few generations, the descendants of that original rightful heir are likely to slip back into tyranny if they're left unchecked with all of that power. And thus the cycle of war and rebellion begins anew. This is why empires have remained so popular in fiction. They're an endless wellspring of story ideas. You can pick any point of view at any point in time and you will have a dozen stories to choose from. That's it for empires. Thank you for sticking with me for 4 videos. If you want more help, I offer one-on-one coaching and I have the ultimate world building checklist. It's about 50 pages of prompts and questions to help you cover your bases when you're creating a fantasy or sci-fi world. They're all divided into sections like food, religion, and of course, government and leadership. The idea is to get you thinking about aspects of your world that you may not have considered, and that will help your story stand out from others. This checklist is available for free to patrons on my Patreon page, linked in the description. However, it is also for sale on my website for 99 cents, also linked in the description. I will see you next time. Bye, lovelies.